We're doing the top 10 teachings of Brachos Daf Daled. The first teaching is about whether a Kohen who is going to a burial, the Kohen is not allowed to become tameh. He's not allowed to go to a regular funeral unless it's somebody in his immediate family as defined by the Torah, the Bible, and the Rabbis about specific relatives that a Kohen is allowed to attend their funeral. The question is, most people don't think about this, at the funeral or getting to the funeral, you're passing by other grave sites. Are you allowed to walk near those grave sites or even possibly on top of those grave sites for the Kohen that are, just other people there, not the person who is his close relative? So it turns out that this is a debate between Rashi and the Rambam. Rashi here on Daf Chaf says that the principle of why a Kohen can become tameh, can become ritually impure to a family, is because the Torah permits it, and that is different than the regular law of dechuya. Dechuya means something that is still in place, but some element of it is pushed away. But in this case, according to Rashi, it would be hutra, would be permitted. The Torah, when the Torah laid down the law of Tuma for Kohanim, it never meant to include that law when a Kohen has to bury or be involved in the burial, attend the burial of a relative. At that point, that restriction is momentarily lifted, and the Kohen would be able to attend the funeral, even if it meant that, let's say, in the funeral parlor, there was another aron, there was another casket with somebody else, a non-relative's body in the building, or at the grave site, you'd have to walk to through the cemetery and pass by other things. On the other hand, that's not necessarily the law. That's Rashi's opinion. Many people follow Maimonides. Maimonides famously says, I'm going to read here from Rabbi Soloveitchik in Rishimas Shiurim, the following. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, he brings down the Rambam, and this is, here we go. Fascinating Rambam. The Rambam says, sorry about that. Great Rambam here. Psaka Rambam, he starts with the Tzarech Iyun, but I'll start from here. Vina Shitas Rambam who detumas Kohen lekrova havadchuya. The opinion of the Rambam is that the ritual impurity that's permitted for a Kohen for certain close family relatives is in the category of dechuya, this concept of it just temporarily or in a restrictive sense allows for that particular relative to for the Kohen to become ritually defiled by. And it creates a fulfillment of the requirement of the relatives to mourn by participating in the funeral. It's because the Kohen defiles his sanctity and he violates the prohibition against becoming ritually impure because of his relative, that defines his kiyum mitzvot avelut. In fact, that may actually be the biblical source of mourning, according to the Rambam, other than the historical biblical stories of mourning, which happen all the time. But in halacha, It's more, we're not so interested just in what they did as much as what was required. So the mitzvah of Avelut would seem to appear because of the mitzvah of the Kohanim to go against their holiness of not becoming defiled. As the Maimonides says, how heavy or serious is the mitzvah of mourning? Because of it, a Kohen's usual prohibition against becoming impure, ritually defiled by a corpse, is pushed away. In order for that person to deal with his deceased loved one and to mourn for them. Shenamar ki im l'she'ero hakarov elav limo laviv, as the verse says, for these relatives like a mother, father, brother, sister, there's certain limiting qualifications. We're not going to get into that right now. Lo yitama mitzvahs aseh ad kan l'shona. That is a positive mitzvah. Which, by the way, is a debate in the Talmud whether it's a mitzvah or reshus, but the Rambam paskins that it is a mitzvah, it's required. This idea of being allowed to be involved in the burial and attending the burial of the Kohen's deceased relatives does not permit the Kohen to be, wantonly becoming ritually impure even during that period. It seems that the Rambam argues on Rashi that according to Rashi, as we said, it would be permitted and the Kohen would just be able to attend his relative's funeral and not have to worry so much about if he had to enter into the if the burial site was had to be entered into, walked through the funeral, a little bit of the cemetery. By the way, our custom is to try to follow the Rambam, so the best thing to do is to get a plot for a Kohen that's close to the road so that the person doesn't have to walk through the cemetery, just steps right out of the road and right next to the grave site of their relative. If this was not done, then discuss with your rabbi whether there are leniencies and how to go about following the other opinion of Rashi, perhaps, or trying to fulfill the Rambam as best as possible. I'm not going to explain that. That's not relevant for what we need to do. But anyway, that's something of great interest and has some practical application today. If one is a rabbi or one is a Kohen and they need to know certain limits on what a Kohen could do even when they are permitted to attend a close family member's funeral. Just reminds me of the Ishbitzer Torah, which is, why is it that a Kohen cannot become ritually impure? Only for these close relatives, or of course a Meis Mitzvah, somebody who doesn't have anybody else to care for them. And the Ishbitzer says that the reason is that a Kohen's job is to be upbeat, to serve God with love. And if the Kohen becomes too preoccupied with dealing with death, if the Kohen becomes a funeral caretaker type person, or even maybe a regular rabbi who's often dealing with providing solace for people who lose a loved one, but it's a very emotional thing to get involved with and sometimes a little bit depressing, the Kohen won't be able to do his job of serving God with love, and that is the Ishbitzer's psychological reason for the idea of Tumah. I remember Reb Shlomo teaching, and Reb Zalman often quoting him, that was the challenge that the Jewish people had after the Holocaust. So many of our rabbis and our teachers had either been victims, survivors of the Holocaust, witnessed this terrible atrocities, lost many of their family members, and because of that, it got into their love of God. It affected their love of God, and many of them had a certain sadness and didn't necessarily convey the positiveness of Torah and our relationship with the Ribbon Shalom. Obviously, as the Holocaust is not such a present thing, and it becomes more of a historical thing, that pain will recede, and we hope that people will be able to focus more on the positive. Okay, let's go to number 2. Number 2 was a rabbi rips off a woman's cloak because it's shatnez. Is this person a hero or an insensitive brute? Let's take a look at the Gemara. The Gemara says the following. Rav Amel Papa Abaya, Maishna Rishonim de Ischar Shlahu Nisa or Maishna Anan de Lo Mischar Shlahu Nisa. What is the difference between us and the earlier generations? The earlier generations, more miracles occurred to them, and the latter generations, less miracles occurred to them. And the Gemara says, is it because they learned more? And then it rejects that because it describes how the later generations actually learned more than the earlier generations. Rather, the reason that's given is Kamoi Hava Kamasu Nafshayu Akadushas Hashem. The earlier generations were more likely to give their life for the sake of the sanctity of God's name. Anan lo masina nafshina kedushas Hashem. Us, on the other hand, we're not likely to sacrifice ourselves for the sanctification of God's name. Now here is the story, which is number 2. See, number 2. Ki hadar Rav Ada bar Ava. This sage, Rav Ada bar Ava, right? His father had a great name. His father's name was Love, Ahava. Chazia lahahi kutis dahavis levisha Carlebach b'shuka. He saw a certain woman. It turns out the woman was a kutis, was not Jewish, but he didn't know that. And he did know that she was wearing a carlebach. A carlebach is an outerwear, a cloak, that the commentaries say was made of shatnez, of wool and linen that were interwoven together. Sabra de Bas Yisrael, he mistakenly thought her to be a Jewish woman. Kam kare mineh. He got up and ripped off the garment from her. Now, that's, first of all, why would you rip off anyone's clothes? And secondly, why would you rip off a woman's clothing? Now, those of us who learned Daf 19, remember that the Gemara there says, at least according to some girsaot, according to some readings, that when you see your teacher, it was this. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Hamotzi Klein Bibigdo Poshan Afilu B'Shuk. Some people have, and then it concludes with Kol Makom Sheyeshchil Hashem In Chok and Kavod L'Rav. That when you have or you find in somebody else's clothing shatnez, you take it off of them, you rip it off of them, even in the street. And since it says you don't give honor to your teacher in a place where there's a desecration of God's name, so many people learn that this is talking about even your teacher. If you find your teacher on the street wearing shatnez, you literally will rip off the cloak or the coat or the jacket off of your teacher. So in that sense, woman, man, teacher, student, it doesn't matter. It's a violation, not just of a prohibition, but somehow it's a chil Hashem. Now the question is why it could be because every sin is a chil Hashem. It could be that shatnez in particular has an element of chil Hashem. Perhaps it's because it represents something where the garment represents your nigiyah, which means your self-interest in something, and your self-interest doesn't allow you to see that you might be doing something wrong. You're wearing the wrong garment, a garment that the Torah prohibits. Without getting into the possible explanations of why this mitzvah in particular is chosen, which there are definitely reasons to be given, he rips off this woman's garment. Not only is this something that would be strange if the woman was Jewish, it turns out she wasn't even Jewish. Now, Igloi Milsa Dekutis, it turns out that he finds out that this woman is a Kutis, a non-Jew, Kutian, he. And Shamua Ba'arba Mezuzi, the local authorities decide that when you embarrass somebody, you get a fine. And they said he would have to pay 400 zuz as a way of compensating this woman for being embarrassed, for having her cloak ripped off of her. Omar la mai shemecha. He asked this lady, ma shemech, what's your name? Amra le matun. She told him, my name is Matun. Amra la masun. Arba me zuze shavya. He said, masun. You cost me 400 zuz. Masun could either be a wordplay on 200, or it could be a wordplay on patience. I was not patient. If I would have been patient, I would have saved 400 zuz. In other words, I'm now going to give over the teaching of one of my favorite teachers, the Mea Shiloach, the Ishbitzer Rebbe. The Ishbitzer Rebbe explains the following. What's going on in this story? It's a weird story. The Ishbitzer Rebbe says that if you look at the story, what you'll realize is that the story represents a shift between the old and the new. Every generation needs to know, what is it that's being taught to their generation? Every day needs to know, what is the thing that we need to do today? Every moment needs to know, what is the mitzvah of the moment? Now, what this rabbi learned from the woman that he encountered is that he had acted hastily. And that time of non-thinking and doing and acting without really understanding what was happening has passed. Perhaps at an earlier generation, God would guide the Kanaim, the zealots like Pinchas, in their attack on Zimri. But at this time, a mistake is often going to occur. So even though his intention was l'shem shamayim, he also got a message from this story that this is no longer the way to operate. And this brings us back to a concept of zealotry and a larceny in pretty much like making God the focal point of everything, even in your interactions with other people, and acting first and asking questions later, is not the derech, so to speak. It's not the way of today. It was the way of an earlier generation, and they did it because that was who they were. But this story conveys a message, the Ishbitzer says, that this is no longer the way. It was the way, and then it's transitioning into what we have to do today, which is metinut, hisiashvut, which means patience, understanding, learning, talking, explaining. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3 is rabbis who hang out near women's mikvahs, asking for trouble, or saints without desire. Let's look at the Gemara. The Gemara says, Rav Gidol have a rugel to have a azol v'yasev ashare de tefillah. A sage by the name of Rav Gidol would regularly sit by the mikvah, by the entranceway of the mikvah, the women's mikvah. Amar lahu hechi tvilu v'hachi tvilu. He would tell the women that were going in, here's what you should do to make sure that you have the proper immersion in the mikvah. He would give them halachic advice about the nature of immersion. There are many details of the halacha, and he'd be there advising them. Amr le Rabbanan, the rabbis told him, Loi kamistafe mar mi'itzahara. What about the concept that here you are, women are going into the mikvah. It's a very kind of vulnerable time for them. There's a concept of tzniut. I'm not even talking about, I'm assuming that he didn't see them getting undressed. I'm assuming he talked to them as they were entering into the mikvah, into the room that they would get undressed in. But the fact is, he knows what they're about to do, and he would talk to them, and this was a form of intimacy, of having these conversations with them, that in theory could lead him to arouse his Yetzer Hara, and this is not a good idea. Still not a good idea. So he says, Amar lahu damyin ba'ape kikake chaviri. They are to me like white swans. In other words, they're beautiful, but I don't have a sexual attraction to them. Question is, there's another parallel Gemara of a rabbi who would take the bride on her wedding night and put her on his shoulders and dance with her on his shoulders. And that rabbi said, she's like wood to me, meaning I don't get sexually attracted to women. Again, it's a very strange Gemara because we also say, Ein apitripus la'arayas. You can't trust anyone when it comes to men and women being in situations like this. So this is not a halachic ruling. This would be against the halacha, just like it would be against the halacha to have the bride ride on your shoulders on her wedding night. We don't paskin like that. We would also not paskin that a rabbi should be sitting at the entranceway of a mikvah talking to the women as they come in. But he felt he was on the level. A very strange story, but a story nonetheless. Now, another story. Rabbi Yochanan he would also sit near the mikvah. He wouldn't answer their questions, but he said, Amar kisilkan benos Yisrael va'asim b'tvila mistaklan bi v'nehavelahu zar d'shipura kavasi. He said the Jewish women, when they come out of the mikvah, they'll look at me and they'll have beautiful children like me. Rabbi Yochanan was known to be very beautiful. In the story of Rabbi Yochanan and Rosh Lakish's first meeting, Rosh Lakish thought that Rabbi Yochanan was a beautiful woman, or beautiful enough that it didn't matter whether he was a man or a woman. Rabbi Yochanan, that's a whole wild story. The bottom line is that there was a concept that people believed in, is that when a person would see something before or around the time of intercourse, that would somehow affect kind of like the DNA or some, I don't know, they didn't know about DNA then, but that would affect the type of child that was born. So that was Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, the Gemara doesn't say, how could he do that? What about the Yetzer Hara? That might be because Rabbi Yochanan could hardly see. He had very long eyelashes. It could be he was very old. It could be that they just trusted him. I don't know the answer. It's a very, very strange story. Both of these stories are very strange. Not all stories in the Talmud are, this is what this great rabbi did, we should do it. On the contrary, these stories could be, this is what these rabbis did, we should not do it. We don't quite understand who they were, why they did this. It doesn't fit into the regular way things are. And we're not going to learn from them, even though they did this. That's number 3. Number 4 is, do women have to say the Shema? There's a very fascinating Mishnah about women and mitzvot. The Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf Amud Aleph and the top of Chaf Amud Beis is the following: Nashim va'avadim k'tanim. What I'm more concerned here is the women here. Piturin mikriya Shema, are not required to say the Shema. That's the morning and evening Shema. Umin hatfilin, they're not required to wear tefillin. V'chayavim b'tefillah, they are obligated in prayer. This is presumably 3 times a day, or at least twice a day, shachar and mincha. Uv'mezuzah, and to have a mezuzah on the doorposts. Uv'birchat hamazon, and grace after meals. The Gemara says kriya Shema. The Gemara analyzes these different things the Mishnah has mentioned. The reading of the Shema. Pshita, obvious. Mitzvah shazman gramahu. That is a positive time-bound mitzvah, meaning it relates to specific times of the day, and therefore there's a principle that women are not obligated in mitzvah shazman grama. V'chol mitzvah shazman grama nashim peturos. The Gemara says, Mahu detema, I might have thought, Hayel v'isbe malchus Shemaim, since in the Shema, the main objective of the Shema, and especially the opening verse of the Shema, is, and the first paragraph, is the idea of the kingship of heaven, which means you are accepting that God is the ultimate authority and sets the direction of what is right for you in your life, that's something women have to do as well. Kamash Malan, comes the Mishnah to tell you that nonetheless you are not obligated to do that. Interestingly enough, many of the poskim do not paskin like the Gemara. They do not rule like the Gemara. They rule that women have to say the Shema, at least the first verse, or the first verse and the first paragraph, morning and evening. The question is, why would the Rishonim and the halachic authorities rule against the Gemara? In fact, this bothers some people so much that they say that they had a different Gemara. Let's take a look at some of these commentators. So this is the Rambam. The Rambam rules like our Gemara and says women are P'tur Mikriya Shema. In our Chaim, the Shulchan Aruch writes, they're Pater, rules like the Rambam, P'tur Mikriya Shema, Neshi Mitzvah Shasman Grama, V'nachon hu l'lamdan she'ikabla alein al malchus Shema, but it would be proper to teach them to accept the yoke of heaven, which means they should really say it. Hagal, the Ramah that the Ashkenazim generally rule like, says, V'sheyikru lepachus pasuk rishon, at the very least, the women should read the first pasuk. Now, that's not what I wanted to show you, but that's interesting. What I wanted to show you is the Beis Yosef, who's the same author as the Shulchan Aruch, but it's another work. He quotes another author by the name of Sefer Ohel Moed, that they are required to accept the unity of God by reciting the first verse, which is what the Ramah says. It's also brought down in Masechta Sofrim, and the Shulchan Aruch, as we brought down, it looks like it's a good idea, but not required. The bottom line is that sometimes one should do something where the Gemara says there's a havamina, which means there's a strong reason why I would think that reciting the Shema would be obligatory. And even though women are not strictly speaking required, some of the rabbis do require it because of the importance of what the Shema does represent. So the bottom line is women should especially both Sephardic and Ashkenazic women, should say the Shema. They should probably try to say the entire Shema, but at the very least, the first verse and the first paragraph, if possible, every evening and every morning. So that's about reciting the Shema. Now we're going to go to number 4. No, that was number 4. Now we're going to go to number 5, is do women have to daven every day? Now, surprisingly, they do. Why I say surprisingly? Because here's where it gets complicated. Women are not obligated in the minyan. So for much of time, the minyan goers have been mostly men, with exceptional women, a woman perhaps who wants to say Kaddish nowadays. Even 100 years ago, I believe there were some women who would want to say Kaddish, and so they would attend the synagogue once in a while. In reality, really, women should be encouraged to attend a daily minyan if they have nothing to do at that time of great importance. But that's not often the case in many communities. Shabbos is different. Most communities encourage women to attend services, Shabbos and Yontif, and of course, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But that leads me to the bigger question, which is, once we make any differences between a woman's obligation and a man's obligation, and we create some looseness in interpretation of what a woman is to do about davening in this case, what will often happen is you'll have some women who do the whole davening. I have members of my family who daven the entire day. What do I mean the entire day? I don't mean they daven for 10 hours. I mean they start davening in the morning, and then they interrupt their davening to do whatever they need to do. And then they daven a little more, and then they go back to doing whatever they need to do. And this goes on for hours, meaning it maybe would take them an hour to daven, but because they don't have an hour, they do it in 10 installments of 6 minutes or so. And it's just the weirdest thing to watch, is people like working in the kitchen and then going and davening and then going back to work and something else, getting on the phone. I'm not used to that. When I daven. Occasionally I have to divide it into, 2, but the real main davening is I don't like to be interrupted. So that's like an example of the type of thing you're going to see. Or other women who come from very religious households who just don't daven. But here the Gemara says women are obligated to daven. And let's look at the Gemara on that. They are obligated in prayer because prayer is a request for divine mercy. But I'm going to add in another issue here, which really gets back to the heart of why they really have to say Shema as well as daven. There are many things in the Shema that are not just about a biblical requirement to recite Torah or the words of the Shema every morning and every evening. Many other things, such as Avas Hashem, the Gemara itself outlines these things: the love of God, the fear of God, the accepting of the mitzvos, the accepting of reward and punishment, the idea of Yitzias Mitzrayim, the exodus from Egypt, are included in the Shema. Many of the mitzvos of Avas Hashem and Yiras Hashem, loving God and fearing God, and other spiritual things that every Jew, man and women, are obligated in, are included in the Birchas Kriya Shema, and the blessings that precede and come after the Shema. So in a sense, even though they're not required in that, you also have this concept of being Samach Geula L'Tefillah, of connecting the Exodus and the future redemption to the Shemon Esrei. So in a sense, it kind of makes it would be fitting for women to say the Shema, the blessings of the Shema, and the Shemon Esrei. They're not technically required to do that, so technically you could say once they're not required to do that, the institution of being Samach Geula L'Tefillah for Shachris, for example, or even for Marv, is technically not required of them, but there's still so much there. So, it's very infrequent for a woman to just step into Shmon Esrei, because there's a whole concept also of getting ready for Shmon Esrei, particularly in Shachris, where you have this long run-up to the Shmon Esrei. So that's why I'm saying it's kind of, how are we teaching women to daven? Are we teaching them to daven Shachris and Mincha, the Shachris that includes everything that precedes the Shema, the Shmon Esrei, like Psukei de Zimra, Brachos Kriya Shema, and then the Shmon Esrei, or are we just telling them to do the Shmon Esrei? Or are we, now I think what we do is we teach girls that when you're in school, you should daven with your class, but not necessarily when you're at home. Meaning we're not, our boys, we're much more involved in teaching them to daven. We take them to the minyan with us. And part of teaching them to daven is sitting next to them and teaching them. Now, a mother can take her daughter to shul as well, but because they often are not going to shul as often, definitely not during the week as often, there is a number of areas that need to be improved. I'm just being ma'orah this. I'm just bringing this up because tefillah is such an important part of our relationship with God. And even Shema is an important part of our relationship with God. So therefore, it's just something that we need to awaken in us, in our daughters. I think certain schools are inculcating the young women to daven with a lot of love of God and awe of God. And that's very beautiful. And we should hopefully continue to do that so women are really loving to daven and having a close relationship with Hashem through davening, not just on Shabbos, but during the week as well. Okay, that was number 5. Number 6 is about women and kiddush. The Gemara says, Nashil chayavos b'kiddush hayam dvar Torah, that biblically speaking, women are obligated to make kiddush on Shabbos, on Friday night. We're not really talking about Shabbos day so much, because that's not as strong of a requirement. The distinctions will come at a later time. Why is that? After all, it's a positive time-bound mitzvah. And women are generally not obligated in those type of mitzvahs. So Abaye first wants to say they're only rabbinically obligated, and Rava questions that because it says Dvar Torah Kamar, it's biblical. And if it's just rabbinic, you might as well make them rabbinically obligated in mitzvah, all mitzvahs, I say. El Amar Rava, but Rava rather says, Amar Kra, the verse says Zachar v'Shamar. We know the commandments were given twice. Right, they were stated twice, not given twice. They were stated twice. They were only given once, and they were repeated in the book of Devarim. It's repeated a second time, and there are a few discrepancies between the first time it's mentioned in Parshas Yisro and the second time where it's mentioned in Veschanan. Is it Veschanan? My memory is so bad. One of the differences, the first time, it says, Zacharis Yom HaShabbos L'Kadsha, the Gemara in Shavuos explains this, that you should remember the Shabbos to make it holy. And the second time it's listed, it says, Shamar Yom HaShabbos, guard the Shabbos day. So what the Gemara in Shavuos says is that they are interchangeable, right? Zachar b'Shamar b'Dibra Echad Namra, we say in L'Chadodi, that these two were said in one utterance. Right? God said one word, we heard both. But we learn out a halachic observation, Kol sheyeshno b'shmira, yeshno b'schira. Whoever is required to guard the Shabbos, which women certainly are, and the mitzvahs lo saseh of not violating the Shabbos, are also obligated in the remembrance, which is kiddush. Just like they have to guard the Shabbos, they also have to remember the Shabbos when making kiddush. So, in truth, women really should be able to also make kiddush for men, just that practically speaking, many people are not used to that. And I think in halacha it's brought down that it's perhaps better if it's done privately, for let's say a husband and wife. If for some reason the husband is not feeling well, the wife can make kiddush for him, and that is what the halachic ruling is. Really, in theory, she should be able to make kiddush for men in general. That's just not the custom for sociological reasons, minhagim. Okay, number 7. I guess the question would be, if the custom change or there's a place where there is no custom, could that allow for a new custom for women to make kiddush for men? Number 7, why is there a question about if there's a biblical obligation to make birchat hamazon for women? After all, there should be zero question. They should be absolutely obligated, because it's not a mitzvah shazman grama. Let's look at the Gemara. The Gemara says the following: Amar le Ravina l'Rava, Nashim b'birchas hamazon d'oraisa or d'Rabbanan. The obligation that women have to do a grace after meals, is that biblical or rabbinic? The Gemara asks, Lamai nafkamina, meaning if they're required, who cares what level of requirement they have? They're required. What's the halachic distinction between whether it's d'oraisa or d'Rabbanan? So the Gemara says, Lafuke rabim midei chavasan, to fulfill the other people's obligation. In the olden days, they didn't have benchers. One person would lead the benching, and everyone else. Now the leader leads, and everyone else follows along and says it to themselves, or says it along with the leader. In the olden days, the leader would lead and the followers would listen. They didn't necessarily say it. They didn't have a bencher. They didn't read it. So if that would be the case, and a woman would be the leader, would she fulfill the men and others' obligation in reciting Birchas Hamazon? If you say that women have a biblical obligation to do Birchas Hamazon, then their obligation would then fulfill the men's biblical obligation as well, and they would be Yotzei. But if you said the women's obligation is rabbinic, then they're not biblically required, and somebody who's not obligated in the thing can't fulfill other people who are obligated in this instance. The Gemara says, what's the answer? And it quotes a brisa, but here's where the Gemara does not explain at all why there would even be a thought that Birchat Hamazon should not be biblical. After all, it already said that Birchat Hamazon is not a mitzvah shazman grama. It's not caused by time. It's just whenever you eat a meal. That's not caused by time. By time means it has to do with the day or the night or a day of the week or day of the year. But time meaning when you do something versus when you don't do it, that's not time. That's something else. So the question is why? And there's a machlokes Rashi and Tosfos here. Rashi says, it's not Zman Grama. Okay, that's not the Rashi I'm looking for. He says, Oder Abanan, because in the benching, it says, on the good land that I'm giving you, and the land was generally not given to the women to divide and settle in. There's exceptions like the Benos Slavchad, but that is them inheriting the portion of their father, who was a man. Okay, now we're going to take a look at Tosfos. Tosfos quotes Rashi, and he doesn't like Rashi's interpretation. He says, "V'teim mekonim levim nami tivai sharei lo natul chelik b'aretz." There are other people, men like Kohenim and Levim. They don't inherit the land either. So that this question should be about them, whether they're biblically obligated. And then somebody like me, who's a Levi, I wouldn't be able to fulfill other people's obligation if I would be leading the benching. Ella yeshlomar. The time it's because of something else, because it talks about the covenant of the circumcision, which women don't have. Although arguably you could say that they have a bris, you could have a circumcision without having physical circumcision. There's a concept like that in the Gemara. And the Torah that we taught us, women do not have a physical circumcision, and neither are they required to study Torah. Now, as I mentioned, they might, just because they don't have a physical circumcision doesn't mean that they're not part of the circumcision. And even Torah, they may not be required in certain mitzvahs of Torah, but there are other mitzvahs of Torah, like knowing what Hamaisa Esher Yasun, the acts that they need to perform, the halacha. So this Gemara here really can only be understood in the Gemara that Tosfos is quoting on Mem Ches, I believe it is. Let's see. Yeah, Mem Tes Amud Aleph. I looked up that Gemara, and let me tell you a little secret. After learning the Gemara, it's pretty clear to me there is no reason that women should not be biblically obligated in the theoretical grace after meal. I say that very specifically, theoretical. In actual, once the rabbis created a matbeya shel birchat hamazon, which means they created the actual liturgy, not the theoretical anymore, but the actual, they included words that are not nearly necessary or may not even be necessary for women in it. They included three things that are mostly connected to men. That is what Rashi brings down, the idea of nachla, of inheriting the land, and the two things that Tosfos brings down, which are the bris, circumcision, and the Torah. I don't understand this Gemara. I'm going to reread how I understand this Gemara. I don't believe this Gemara is asking whether women are obligated in the theoretical Birchat Hamazon. I think what it's asking about is the applied Birchat Hamazon, the language of the Birchat Hamazon, the matbeya shel Birchat Hamazon. And here's how I read it. Nashim bebirchat hamazon, women in the matbeya of Birchat Hamazon, as we do it now, as the rabbis on Mem Tes argued. There's a debate whether we need to include all of those things that I just mentioned, those three things. So the halacha becomes that they do, even though women, in theory, they could be two benchings, one for men, one for women. The halacha becomes that we gotta make the benching follow what the men would like to be in there. It's inconsequential, the fact that the women don't need those things. But because we paskin to make one uniform benching that's more man-centric, do women have obligation in our actual text of the Birchat Hamazon? For sure they have an obligation to say something. But do they have an obligation to say the Birchat Hamazon that the rabbis instituted with all these man-centric things? Is that the Oraisa or the Rabbanan? That's how I'm learning it. The Gemara says, "L'may nafka mina." What's the difference? I mean, once we say that they should do that, that's what we instituted. They are biblically required to do something, and rabbinically, at least, they're required to do what we instituted. So, what's the nafka mina? The Gemara answers, "Lafuke rabim yirei chavasan." Whether men who are required to say these things biblically, now that we instituted them for them, in other words, in the details of the text, there is some kiyum of what a man has to say, and a woman may or may not have those same obligations or not. In other words, what's the overriding principle? Is it the chiyuv in the etzem of the eating v'achalta v'savata, or is it the kiyum of these particular things that a man is required to do? A woman, incidentally, has some connection to land, has some connection to Torah, has some connection to bris. She doesn't have to be particularly required of it, just like a Kohen or a Levi. So that's really, Tosfos' question is really the answer. Meaning Tosfos' question about what about a Kohen and a Levi? Are you saying that they can't fulfill other people's obligation? Well, that's really, the answer is, yeah, well, they're close enough. And the question is, are women close enough? And it's really a very troubling Gemara if you think about it. But I just wanted to give you my interpretation on that. Okay, number 8 is God doesn't play favorites unless you're extra good when it comes to benching. Let me explain to you what this is. Zimnan Amrla B'Shmei Rab Ami, Zimnan Amrla B'Shmei Rab Asi. It's told sometimes in the name of Rab Ami, others in the name of Rab Asi. Amr Malachi Hasharis Lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The angel said before God. Ribbani Shalom. Kasu b'sarascha asher lo yisa panim v'lo yikach shochad. It's written in your Torah that you don't play favorites and you don't take bribes. V'halo ata no say panim lisho, but you do show favoritism to Israel. The Chsiv Yisa Hashem panim elecha, as we say in what is now called the Brachos Kohanim, may you lift your eyes favorably, your face favorably towards us. Amar lahem v'chilo esa panim li Yisrael shekasafti lehem b'torah v'chad v'savat v'achtas Hashem elokecha v'heim medaktikim alatzman ad kezayis v'ad kebeitza. Let me explain to you what that means. There's a number of times the Gemara tells us the story. Often it tells us not as a complaint of the angels, but as I think a Roman matriarch who asked this very same question or a slight variation of this question. The question basically is that you want to go to a judge that doesn't know anyone, or if they do, it doesn't matter who they know. The law is the law is the law. They don't say, I like your smile. I'm going to rule in your favor because you're just so charming. They're not charmed, and they don't play favorites. They don't have I like you because your birthday is the same birthday as my son, and I'm going to just rule you. No, we don't do that. So the question is, God is a just justice. And yet, it says, Yisa Hashem panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. It says in the Brachos Kohanim that God should, you should find favor in God's eyes. So, favor means it's not the law; it's above and beyond the law. So, the answer is that when it comes to benching, the Torah says, "V'achalta v'savata," you shall eat and be satisfied, uberachta, and then you will bless God, the Birkat Hamazon. And yet, the rabbis have considerably smaller amounts that they say would obligate a person to bench, even though the person isn't actually satisfied. There's a discussion whether it's a kazayas or a kabeya, also on mem tes, amongst other places, in Brachos and other places as well. I have a lot to say about this, but it is late. So I'll just say this one thing, that there's two Torahs. There's the Torah of Moshe and the Torah of Aaron. And this is based on the Talmud. Torah of Moshe, that Moshe is a dayan. He's a judge. Aaron is a mediator who can help people make a pshar. They can help them make a reconciliation, even if it's not technically by the letter of the law. And that's why Aaron was Oev Shalom V'Rodah Shalom Oves Habrios Mekavan LaTorah. He was very close with the people. You don't want the dayan to be too close with the people because you have to have the judicial kind of calculated coldness of the application of the law, not the warmth of, I like you, I'm going to do whatever I can to favor you. Now, there is an element in Torah that is the cold and calculated requirements of what the halacha is. And then there are certain things that are above and beyond that. Our choice, the way the Gemara is explained here, to expand the meaning of when we need to do Birkat Hamazon to beyond what we're required to do when we're actually satisfied, that means that we're not just relating to God on a measure for measure. We measure everything, he measures everything on a justice scale. But rather, we're also interacting with him as friends and lovers, and therefore God does sometimes, see us in favor. Because the question is, how are we approaching God? What is our relationship with God? Im kibanim, im ka'abadim. Are we coming in as sons of God, daughters of God? Or are we coming in as servants of God or subjects of God? So there's a lot more on this. There's a beautiful Ishbitzer Torahs on this. Baal Shem Tov Torahs on the nature of food and the word of God that gives life force to the food. So it's about the awareness of the inner blessing of the food rather than the physicality of how much food you're eating and so on. But let's continue with number 9. Number 9 is the institution of Ezra. Now, what is that? Number 9 is a Mishnah. The Mishnah says, Bal Kari Mahar Balibo. A Bal Kari, somebody had a seminal emission, will think certain things of Kriya Shema. Will think them in his heart without actually saying them. But they won't make the birchas Kriya Shema before or after. On bread, you only make the after blessing, but not the blessing before it. Okay, let's do the Gemara. Amar Ravina. So what is this tefillah? This Tevilas Ezra. So the Rambam says, I'll read it a little bit from Rishima Shiurim for you on this. Okay. We established that a Balkari is forbidden to study Torah. The Gemara is going to say, because we don't want the Torah scholars to be constantly with their wives, like chickens. Medekanas Ezra, from the institution of Ezra. Medekanas based in Shul Achrav Asur B'Tefillah. And then a latter based in also expanded the scope of that Isur to prayer as well, not to pray when you're a Balkari before going to the mikvah. This is the Rambam in the laws of Kriya Shema. The Ezra Beistino Tiknu Shlo Yikra B'Divrei Torah Balkari Levado. That there's this like specific thing that a Balkari is not allowed to read the Shema before going read Torah before going to the mikvah. But it makes them different than the regular people that have regular tuma, other forms of tuma where they are not limited in their requirements to learn Torah. They have to learn Torah and say Shema. But in this case, he has to go. The mikvah pasha tekanasa subchol yisrael. But this tekana never spread in Israel. V'lo hayakoch b'rov hatzibur lamod ba. And there wasn't enough power or ability in the community to uphold it. Lefichach batla. Therefore, it became nullified. And the custom has become for the people, even as a Balkari, without going to the mikvah, to read Torah and read the Kriya Shema. The question that the Rishima Shiurim and Rabbi Soloveitchik asks is the nature of the relationship between the first institution of Ezra and the second institution of the latter based in. Is the latter based in just expanding on Ezra, or are they making a new takana? That's one of the questions. Anyway, this is part of a much more extended conversation of the nature of halacha, and the customs of halacha need to have some level of being accepted. Somebody writing something in the Mishnah Brura, let's say, or the Aruch HaShulchan, if the community doesn't kind of pick up on that interpretation of the law or that custom, just because it's in a book does not make it the halacha per se. The halacha has to do not just with the authority of the rabbi or the Beis Din, but it also has to do with the acceptance of the people. Again, it's a very complicated sugya, so I don't want to oversimplify it, which I am definitely oversimplifying it right now, but it's something that needs to be learned and studied at great length. Okay, number 10, final one for today, is this idea of hirhur kedibur or not, is thought like action. Amar Ravina Zosamer here Kedibur Dami Disakadat Cloak Lav Kedibur Dami Lama Mahar. Ravina points out that it must be that thinking the thing is like saying it, because if it's not, why bother thinking it for the Shema? Elamai here Kedibur Dami. Are you saying that? So then why don't, if it's like saying it, then you might as well Yotzei B'Sosa, then say it out loud, or just say it. The Gemara has an answer to ask from the scene. Anyway, the bottom line is that this concept of hirhur kedibur is extensively debated, and the halacha basically is that you should say everything, articulate everything, unless you can't for some reason. And then if the best you can do is think it, then you can think it. If you're like in a place where there's a dirty diaper and you can't say the word, you could think the word. But this also gets back to one of the core concepts in Chabad Hasidus, which is based on Tanya, which is this idea of the kedushas haguf, the sanctity of the maisa mitzvah, of the act of the mitzvah. Why it's not enough to have a machshava of Torah, a machshava of tefillah, and why it needs to have akimas vasav, why it needs to have the movement of the lips, because there's an important and integral part of the tikkun of this world, which is the tikkun haguf, the fixing of the body. On the other hand, when you have a panemiustika hirhur, when you have an inner thought, like a hirhur tshuva, like the Gemara says, somebody who says, that the person tells a woman he betroths himself to her on condition that he's a tzaddik gomer, we do say that it's at least a kedushin because out of doubt, because it may very well be a kedushin because shema hirhur tshuva Allah belibo. Perhaps the person had a momentary awakening, an inner awakening of tshuva, which means there is the value of inner awakening that we can't know how amazingly a person can turn around everything in a moment internally. So this is a conversation and we should look deeper into it. Thank you for watching.